1865, a 31-year-old Civil War veteran named William Wallace Cargill bought a small grain warehouse in Conover, Iowa. It was barely a shack, wooden walls, a leaky roof, and a dirt floor. The town had maybe 200 people in it. Cargill had no formal education in commerce, no wealthy family backing him, and no particular reason to believe he would amount to anything more than a man who stored other people's wheat for a modest fee. That is how the story begins. A shack in Iowa, and today, the company that bears his name generates more annual revenue than Apple. It operates in over 70 countries, employs more than 150,000 people, and touches nearly every single thing you ate today, whether you realize it or not. The flour in your bread, the cocoa in your chocolate, the oil in your salad dressing, the corn syrup in your soda, the feed that fattened the chicken on your plate. Cargill is inside all of it. And the family that still privately owns and controls this empire, the Macmillan family, descendants of William Cargill himself, has never once taken the company public. No stock exchange, no shareholders demanding transparency, no SEC filings that the average person can read. They operate in near total darkness, and they have done so for 160 years. This is not a conspiracy. This is not a theory. This is just business, and conducted at a scale that most governments on Earth cannot match, by a family that most people on Earth have never heard of. And that is exactly how they like it. William Cargill died in 1909, deep in debt, with a business empire that had grown wildly, but chaotically, across grain storage facilities, railroads, and feed mills spanning the American Midwest. He left behind a complicated estate and a son-in-law named John Macmillan Sr., who was married to his daughter Edna. Now, Macmillan did not just inherit a business, he inherited a mess. There were creditors threatening to dismantle everything Cargill had built. There were legal disputes and angry investors and banks circling like vultures over a carcass. But Macmillan had something Cargill had lacked: discipline. Cold, patient, architectural discipline. He restructured the debt. He sold off the unprofitable limbs. He cut everything that bled and kept everything that breathed. Within a decade, Sohai had turned a near-bankrupt grain business into a quietly profitable machine. And then he did something that would define the company for the next century. He kept it in the family. When John Macmillan Sr. died, control passed to his son, John Macmillan Jr. When John Jr. stepped back, control passed to the next generation. The company grew and grew, and the family held on tighter with every decade. They brought in professional managers to run day-to-day operations, and smart executives recruited from elite universities and rival corporations. But the ownership never left the bloodline. The Macmillans and the Cargills, two intertwined families descended from that original Iowa warehouse, continued to hold the majority of shares in a company that had quietly become one of the most powerful private entities on Earth. By the 1970s, Cargill was already one of the largest grain traders in the world. The Soviet Union, facing catastrophic wheat shortages, came to Cargill with a desperate need, and Cargill delivered. The company brokered what became known as the Great Grain Robbery of 1972, a deal so large it shocked American economists and sent domestic food prices skyrocketing. The U.S. government had barely any idea the deal was happening before it was done. Cargill had moved faster than the State Department. The company had better intelligence networks than most national agencies. They had people on the ground in Moscow, or in the grain fields of Ukraine, in the ports of Leningrad, while Washington was still reading reports. That gap between what Cargill knows and what governments know has only widened since then. To understand why governments cannot stop this family, you first have to understand what Cargill actually is. Most people imagine food companies as brands: Kellogg's, Nestle, Tyson. You see their logos, You buy their products off shelves. Cargill is not that. Cargill is what the industry calls a commodity trader and agricultural processor. They do not need your brand recognition because they are not selling to you. They are selling to the companies that sell to you. They sit one invisible layer above the brands you recognize, controlling the raw materials those brands depend on. Cargill trades grain futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Cargill crushes soybeans into oil and meal in plants across South America, Asia, and Europe. Cargill refines palm oil from Indonesian and Malaysian plantations. Cargill processes cocoa beans in facilities across West Africa before that cocoa ever reaches a chocolate maker. Cargill slaughters and processes beef, pork, and turkey in massive facilities across the United States. Cargill makes the salt that goes into food production globally. Cargill produces the animal feed that fattens the livestock that becomes the meat in every grocery store in the developed world. They are not just in the food supply chain. In many critical segments, they are the food supply chain. And because they are private, the true scale of their operations is almost impossible to verify from the outside. Cargill releases some financial data voluntarily because their banks and creditors require it. But they are under no legal obligation to disclose the kind of information a public company must reveal. No quarterly earnings calls. No investor presentations breaking down market share by region. No uncomfortable annual meetings where shareholders demand answers. The McMillan family answers to no one outside their own boardroom. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate structure they have maintained through enormous pressure to change it. In the 1990s, as Cargill's revenue crossed $80 billion annually, there were serious internal conversations about taking the company public. A public offering would have made members of the McMillan and Cargill families extraordinarily wealthy, even by the standards of people who were already extraordinarily wealthy. Investment banks lined up. Analysts projected a valuation that would have ranked the IPO among the largest in American history. The families held meetings. The debates were fierce. And in the end, they said no. The reason they gave, and the reason they have repeated in the decades since, is control. Going public means answering to shareholders. It means quarterly pressure to maximize short-term profits. It means activists buying shares and demanding the company change direction. It means disclosure laws and regulatory scrutiny and public attention. The McMillans did not build a 100-year empire by thinking in quarters. They built it by thinking in generations, and they were not about to hand that away for a single payday, no matter how large. But the private structure is not just a strategic preference, it is a shield. And the companies and governments that have tried to crack that shield have learned again and again how difficult it is to break. In 2009, the European Commission launched an investigation into the cocoa industry, looking at price fixing and market manipulation allegations involving major traders, including Cargill. The investigation dragged on for years. The complexity of Cargill's international structure made document requests enormously complicated. Subsidiaries operated in multiple jurisdictions with different legal standards. Eventually, the case wound down without the dramatic resolution investigators had hoped for. Cargill had not necessarily done nothing wrong. The system simply made proving it extraordinarily difficult. In Brazil, their environmental prosecutors spent years building cases against soy traders, including Cargill, for their alleged role in driving Amazon deforestation. Farmers cleared forests to plant soybeans. Cargill bought those soybeans. The supply chain connection seemed direct to critics, but Cargill argued they could not verify the origins of every bushel they purchased, and that their internal certification systems were sufficient. The legal battles continued across multiple administrations, in multiple political cycles, as the Amazon continued to shrink. The forest did not wait for the lawsuits to resolve. In the United States, antitrust regulators have taken occasional looks at commodity trading concentration, beef processing concentration, and agricultural market dominance. Reports have been written, congressional hearings have been held. Farmers have testified about feeling trapped, forced to sell to whoever offers the highest price in their region because there are so few buyers left. And Cargill, along with the 2 or 3 other massive traders that dominate alongside them, has continued to grow. The reason is structural, not conspiratorial. Governments regulate what they can see, and they regulate what voters demand they address. Cargill operates at a level of complexity and international spread that most regulatory agencies are not equipped to handle, and at a remove from the consumer experience that most voters never think about. Nobody sees Cargill when they are angry about food prices. They see the grocery store. They see the brand on the package. Cargill is invisible, and invisibility in business is a form of armor. The family that runs this company understands that invisibility better than almost anyone alive. The Macmillans today are among the wealthiest families in the United States, but you will not find them on yachts at Monaco or giving interviews to celebrity magazines. The Forbes billionaire list estimates the combined family wealth at somewhere between $8 and $12 billion, spread across several branches of the family that now includes over a dozen heirs. But because Cargill's internal valuation is not public, even those estimates are educated guesses. The family might be significantly wealthier. They might be carrying more debt than outsiders assume, and nobody knows for certain because they do not have to tell anyone. What is known is this: the family holds its shares through a complex web of trusts, family holding companies, and legal structures designed to survive generational transitions without fragmenting the ownership. When heirs are born, they do not simply receive stock. They enter a controlled system that manages how shares can be sold, transferred, or voted. The system is designed specifically to prevent any one faction of the family from breaking away and selling their position to outside buyers. It is, in the truest sense, a family that has legally bound itself together in order to maintain control of something they consider irreplaceable. That thing they consider irreplaceable is not just a business. It is a position. A position in the global food system that took 160 years to build. That cannot be replicated by any amount of money in any reasonable time frame, because it is not just about capital. It is about infrastructure, relationships, knowledge, and presence in every critical node of how the world eats. And the world, whether it knows it or not, depends on them. Every day, Cargill's trading desks in Geneva, Minneapolis, Singapore, and Sao Paulo are watching the same weather satellites, the same crop reports, the same shipping manifests and port data that government agricultural agencies watch. But they are watching with more experienced eyes, with more sophisticated models, and with a financial stake in being right that no government analyst possesses. When drought hits the Ukrainian wheat belt, Cargill knows before the markets price it in. When a monsoon delays the Indian soybean harvest, Cargill has already adjusted its positions. When a political crisis threatens Brazilian export routes, Cargill is rerouting before most logistics companies have heard the news. This is the machinery behind the title on the screen. Not a shadowy cabal making secret decisions in a back room. A machine. An extraordinarily well-built, deeply experienced, globally positioned machine that has been optimized over generations to be better at moving food and money than any competitor, and better at surviving scrutiny than any regulator. The question is not whether the family is evil. The question is whether the structure they have created, intentionally or not, has become too large, too opaque, and too essential to fail safely. And that question does not have a clean answer, which is exactly what makes this story worth understanding. Because in 1865, a 31-year-old veteran bought a grain warehouse in Iowa. And 160 years later, the family that inherited what he built can move enough food to feed a continent before your government knows it happened. That is where part 1 ends. And in part 2, we go inside the machinery itself, the deals that shaped modern food prices, the employees who have spoken about what they saw, the regulators who tried to break the grip and what stopped them, and the single decision this family made in the late 1990s that may have locked the global food system into its current shape for another century. There is a town in Minnesota called Wayzata. It sits on the western shore of Lake Minnetonka, like about 15 miles outside Minneapolis. The houses there are large and quiet, set back from the road behind old trees and long driveways. The people who live in Wayzata do not generally advertise what they do for a living. They send their children to good schools, they donate to local causes, and they move through the world with the particular confidence of people who have never had to explain themselves to anyone. Several members of the McMillan family live in Wayzata, and just down the road, so in a corporate campus in Minnetonka, sits the global headquarters of Cargill Incorporated. The proximity is not coincidental. It is a physical expression of the relationship between the family and the company. Close enough to oversee, quiet enough to be forgotten. This is where the decisions happen. Not in Geneva, not in Washington, not in Brussels. Here, in a suburb that most Americans could not find on a map, a small group of people make choices that affect what billions of other people pay for food, whether they know it or not. To understand how that works in practice, you need to understand one specific period. The years between 1998 and 2008 were the decade that remade the global food system, and Cargill was at the center of almost every major shift that occurred. In 1998, a small Swiss trading company called Andre & Company collapsed after decades of aggressive grain trading left it overextended and exposed. Andre had been one of the 5 dominant grain traders in the world, part of what traders called the ABCD Group, which stood for Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. When Andre fell, the 4 remaining giants absorbed its market share, its relationships, and in some cases, its personnel. Cargill moved fastest. Within 18 months, Cargill had picked up critical trading positions and infrastructure that Andre left behind in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet republics, and in sub-Saharan Africa. The collapse of Andre was not Cargill's doing, but their response to it was a masterclass in how the company has always grown, not through dramatic hostile takeovers or flashy acquisitions, through patience, positioning, and readiness. They were already present in the markets Andre had abandoned, so they already had the relationships. All they had to do was step into the vacuum before anyone else moved. By 2000, Cargill had agreed to acquire the beef and pork processing operations of Excel, which were already a major Cargill subsidiary, and expanded into turkey processing, animal nutrition, and biofuels simultaneously. The company was not just getting bigger, it was getting wider, deeper into every stage of the food chain, from the genetics of the seed to the packaging of the finished product. Then came the decision that changed everything. In 2002, Cargill completed a transaction that most food industry watchers consider the single most consequential deal in modern agricultural history. They acquired the fertilizer and crop nutrition business of IMC Global, merging it with their own fertilizer operations to create a company called Mosaic. Mosaic became the largest producer of phosphate and potash fertilizer in the world. Phosphate and potash are 2 of the 3 primary ingredients in the fertilizers that make modern industrial agriculture possible. Without them, crop yields collapse. Without those yields, the global food supply cannot support 8 billion people. Mosaic controlled more of the world's accessible phosphate reserves than any other private company on Earth. Think about what that means. The same family that trades the grain also now controlled the fertilizer that grows the grain. The same company that processes the soy also influenced the price of the nutrients that make soy farming viable. The vertical integration was not just deep, it was foundational. Cargill had inserted itself into the biological prerequisites of modern food production. Cargill eventually spun off Mosaic as a separate public company, reducing their direct stake over time. But the period in which they held dominant control over both grain trading and fertilizer production gave them an information and pricing advantage that shaped market structures still in place today. They knew the fertilizer costs before farmers did. They knew the crop projections before the markets priced them in. They were sitting at every table simultaneously. And during that same period, between 2002 and 2008, global food prices did something that shocked economists and destabilized governments. They doubled. In some categories, they tripled. The price of wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans all surged dramatically in what became known as the 2007 to 2008 global food crisis. Riots broke out in Haiti, Egypt, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Indonesia. The United Nations called it a silent tsunami. 37 countries faced serious food insecurity. Governments fell. Protests turned violent. And in fiscal year 2008, Cargill reported its highest profits in company history at that point. Net earnings of roughly $3 billion. That contrast, record profits for the trader, while billions of people could not afford to eat, attracted serious scrutiny. Journalists, academics, and NGOs began publishing investigations into commodity speculation and its relationship to food price spikes. Some economists argued that the financialization of agricultural commodities, the explosion of speculative trading in grain futures by banks and hedge funds, had amplified price swings beyond what supply and demand fundamentals justified. Others argued the price increases were driven by real factors: drought, oil prices affecting transport costs, biofuel mandates diverting crops from food to fuel. Cargill's public position was that they were a stabilizing force in volatile markets, not a destabilizing one. They argued that commodity traders provide liquidity, help farmers hedge their price risk, and ensure that food moves efficiently from places of surplus to places of need. These arguments are not fabricated. There is genuine economic literature supporting the function of commodity traders in agricultural markets. But the argument was also being made by the party that profits most when volatility is high, which is not a coincidence that critics were willing to ignore. The investigations went nowhere decisive, because the trading took place across multiple jurisdictions, involving legal instruments regulated by different national frameworks. Assembling a coherent regulatory case was functionally impossible. By the time one agency obtained documents, the relevant trades had settled and the market had moved on. The food crisis ended, prices stabilized, and the political urgency evaporated. The structural questions were left unanswered. This is the pattern that defines Cargill's relationship with regulatory oversight. Not evasion in the dramatic sense, not shredding documents or bribing officials, simply operating at a scale and complexity that outpaces the institutions designed to monitor it. Regulatory agencies are funded by governments operating on annual budget cycles. Cargill operates on generational timelines. Regulatory agencies are staffed by people earning government salaries. Cargill recruits the same experts those agencies rely on, at multiples of the compensation. Regulatory agencies have jurisdiction limited by national borders. Cargill's supply chains cross dozens of borders in a single transaction. The result is a persistent asymmetry. The regulator is always catching up to where the company was, never where it is. And former employees have described the internal culture at Cargill in terms that illuminate why the company has been so difficult to challenge from the outside. Several executives who left the company and later spoke to journalists described an organization with an almost missionary belief in its own necessity. People at Cargill genuinely believe they are feeding the world, not as a PR slogan, but as a foundational conviction. The company does move enormous volumes of food to places that would otherwise face shortages. That is real. The efficiency of their logistics operations has unquestionably contributed to global food security in ways that are measurable and documented. But that conviction also functions as a buffer against criticism. When environmentalists challenge Cargill's sourcing practices in the Amazon, the company responds with programs and certifications and pledges, while the underlying economics that drive deforestation remain intact. When farmers complain about buyer concentration giving them no pricing power, Cargill points to the competitive bids they offer and the infrastructure they provide. When antitrust regulators raise concerns about market dominance, Cargill argues that scale is what makes their service affordable and their supply chains resilient. Every argument has a grain of truth in it. That is what makes them effective. And that is what makes the structural problem so hard to address through conventional regulatory tools. In 2021, a coalition of environmental organizations released a report documenting supply chain links between Cargill's Brazilian soy purchasing and illegal deforestation in the Cerrado, the vast tropical savanna south of the Amazon that has been cleared at rates that rival the Amazon itself, but attracts far less international attention. The report was detailed, sourced, and damning. Cargill acknowledged the findings, committed to a new deforestation pledge with a 2025 deadline, and announced enhanced supply chain monitoring systems. By 2023, independent monitoring groups found that the pace of Cerrado clearing linked to soy expansion had not meaningfully declined. The pledge remained in place, the monitoring continued, the forest continued to shrink. This is not a story of villains doing villainous things. It is a story of incentives. Cargill's business depends on volume. Volume depends on supply. Supply depends on land. And in Brazil, the cheapest new land is land that was recently forest. Every year that passes without a binding legal mechanism forcing change is another year the economics remain the same. Pledges made by private companies to private standards bodies, without enforceable penalties, do not change the underlying math. And the family that owns Cargill is not required to care about the math changing, because no election can remove them, no shareholder vote can override them, and no regulatory body has yet assembled the jurisdictional authority to compel them. The question that researchers and policy analysts now ask is not whether Cargill could be broken up or nationalized, which is not legally feasible in the current framework. The question is whether the global food system has become so dependent on the infrastructure this company controls that losing them would cause more harm than the concentration itself creates. That question has a name in economics. It is called systemically important. It is the same designation applied to large banks after the 2008 financial crisis, the recognition that an institution has grown so embedded in critical infrastructure that its failure would cause cascading damage to the broader system. The United States designated several banks as systemically important financial institutions and applied enhanced oversight as a result. No equivalent designation exists for agricultural commodity traders. There are researchers who have argued it should. A 2019 paper published through the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization examined concentration in agricultural commodity markets and concluded that the four dominant traders, including Cargill, now handled such a substantial share of global grain flows that a coordinated disruption of their operations, whether through financial crisis, geopolitical conflict, or infrastructure failure, could trigger food shortages and import-dependent nations within weeks, not months. Weeks. That is the hidden cost of concentration that never appears in an annual report. Efficiency creates fragility. The leaner and more optimized a supply chain becomes, the less redundancy it contains, and the more catastrophic a disruption becomes. Cargill's systems are extraordinarily efficient. They are also extraordinarily central. And central systems, when they fail large. The family understands this better than anyone. It is part of why they do not sell. If you own something that the world cannot afford to lose, you own something with a value beyond calculation. The Macmillans are not just wealthy because Cargill generates profits. They are wealthy because Cargill generates irreplaceability. And irreplaceability in business is the ultimate form of leverage. The next generation of the family is now coming into positions of influence within the corporate governance structure. They are educated at the same elite universities their parents attended. They are being prepared to take on the same stewardship role that every generation before them has accepted. The trust structures and shareholder agreements that bind the family together were updated and renewed in the 2000s, like ensuring that the concentrated ownership survives another generational transition without fragmentation. Cargill will not look radically different in 2040 than it does today. It will be larger. It will be in more countries. It will be deeper into more stages of the food chain. The data systems will be more sophisticated. The logistics more automated. The supply chain intelligence more precise. But the family at the top, descended from a Civil War veteran who bought a grain warehouse in Iowa, will still be there, still private, still invisible, still essential. There is one final thing worth understanding about why governments cannot stop them, and it is the most honest answer to that question. Governments don't actually want to stop them. Not entirely. Not in any way that would matter. Every major grain importing nation on Earth depends on the trading infrastructure that Cargill and its peers maintain. Egypt buys wheat through commodity markets that these traders dominate. Japan's sources feed grain through networks these companies built. Sub-Saharan African nations import food staples through supply chains that would collapse without the logistics platforms Cargill operates. Breaking up Cargill, or subjecting it to the kind of regulatory control that would genuinely constrain its operations, would require those governments to build replacement infrastructure from scratch. No government has the appetite or the budget to attempt that. So instead, they negotiate, for they issue pledges and get pledges in return. They hold hearings. They commission reports. They announce investigations that quietly resolve. And Cargill continues to grow, and the family continues to hold on, and the grain continues to move, and the world continues to eat. A 31-year-old veteran bought a shack in Iowa in 1865. His grandson's family refused to sell the company for any price. His great-grandchildren built it into something no government could dismantle. And his great-great-grandchildren now sit on the board of the single most important private food company in human history. Largely unknown, largely unaccountable, and entirely indispensable. The food on your table tonight passed through their hands. It will pass through their hands tomorrow, and the day after that. And somewhere in Wayzata, Minnesota, behind the long driveways and the old trees, the family that owns that fact is not watching the news. They do not need to. The news is not about them. It never is. And that, more than any trade deal or legal structure or financial maneuver, is the source of their power. They are invisible. And the invisible thing that feeds the world does not need to answer to anyone.